Thanks for joining us for this archive of Teaching American History's Documents in Detail webinar for October 20th, 2021. Our focus tonight was Abraham Lincoln's 1854 Peoria speech, drawn from our Causes of the Civil War Core Documents collection, which was assembled by Dr. Jason Stevens of Ashland University. We were joined, as always, by our moderator, Dr. John Moser of Ashland University, and Dr. Dan Monroe of Millikin University also joined us tonight in this great discussion.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is John Moser. I'm professor of history and chair of the Department of History and Political Science, as well as of the Master of Arts in American History and Government program at Ashland University. And I'm pleased to welcome you to another episode of Documents in Detail, Teaching American History's webinar series in which we bring together thoughtful scholars to have a conversation about historically significant documents. We encourage all of you joining us today to participate in that conversation, and you may do so by submitting questions via the Q&A box. Please use the Q&A box and not the chat box. That way I only have to monitor one place. We'll try to get to as many of those questions as possible. Within the next week, you'll receive an email with a link to request a certificate of participation, as well as a link that will allow you to access the archived video and audio from tonight's program. The speeches, letters, and other writings that we're using for this year's webinars are all drawn from the various volumes of our core documents series. They're also available at the Ashbrook Center's voluminous document database located at tah.org. The subject of tonight's program comes from the volume on the causes of the Civil War, edited by Jason Stevens. The document we'll be discussing is Abraham Lincoln's 1854 speech on the repeal of the Missouri Compromise. And in order to talk to us about it, we have Dr. Stevens himself. Dr. Stevens is visiting assistant professor of political science at Ashland University, as well as director of teacher programs at the Ashbrook Center. He is joined by Dr. Dan Monroe, associate professor, and John C. Griswold, distinguished professor of history at Millikin University. Both of these gentlemen are faculty members in Ashland University's master's program in American history and government. So glad to have you with us tonight, gentlemen.
Thanks for having me.
Good to be here. Thanks, John.
So the speech on the repeal of the Missouri Compromise is not a document that I had been terribly familiar with. We have a group of teachers here who are undoubtedly eager to know why this document is so important to be included, so as to be included in a core documents volume.
Yeah, that's a really good question, John. I'll go ahead and get the ball rolling here if Dan doesn't mind. I mean, there's a lot to say about this speech. After all, it is a very, very long speech, right? 40 pages unedited. I believe it's the longest speech in Lincoln's collected works. It's the longest speech he ever gave. One of the important things to keep in mind about this speech, one of the great virtues of this speech is I love the beginning of it. Where Lincoln goes through and he gives a history of the United States in regards to the slavery question, from the country's founding up until 1854 and the repeal of the Missouri Compromise by the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And he goes through the various crises that the nation had faced over slavery, from the Northwest Ordinance to the Compromise of 1820, the Missouri Compromise, the nullification crisis of the 1830s, the Compromise of 1850, then finally the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. And the history that Lincoln gives here, it's better than anything you'll find in any textbook anywhere. And the way Lincoln talks about these things, he's very good. He's very interesting. And I think, right, instead of going over that 80-year history or so through the textbook, we can go to Lincoln and he shares that with us. Something else I wanted to say about this speech, something else important to know about it is that Lincoln had served 1 year in Congress, one term in Congress from 1847 to 1849. He finishes up his term and he basically enters the political wilderness. He returns to Illinois. He attends to his law practice. He is content to live a quiet private life, practicing law and raising his family. But then something happened in 1854 that roused him as never before. This was Lincoln's fire bell in the night moment, to borrow a phrase of Jefferson's. That fire bell in the night moment for Lincoln, the thing that roused him and got him out of private life and back into public life, was the repeal of the Missouri Compromise by the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. And the architect, the author of Kansas-Nebraska, Stephen Douglas, and his doctrine of popular sovereignty and the threat that Lincoln saw in popular sovereignty in regards to not calming the issue of slavery, as Douglas had promised, but actually stirring things back up and driving the public mind away from the belief that slavery was in the course of ultimate extinction. Lincoln sees in Douglas his greatest antagonist. We may even say nemesis in Douglas and in popular sovereignty and that doctrine and the threat that it posed to the country. This is 6 years out from Lincoln's election as president in 1860, but really the crisis of the 1850s, the lead up to secession and Civil War. 1854 in Kansas, Nebraska, Stephen Douglas, these are absolutely essential figures and acts to understand how we got from 1776 to 1861.
Dan, what would you like to add to that?
Well, that's a great introduction, and Jason did a fine job of giving some context on Lincoln kind of reappearing on the political scene and being animated to do so by his outrage over the repeal of the Missouri restriction. I would just start off by noting how moderate Lincoln is while he's assailing Douglas. Oftentimes students will puzzle, and it's just a natural question. Well, how does Lincoln go from this obscure figure to become president of the United States? And I think the answer is that Lincoln managed to assail the possibility of the expansion of slavery, but he did it by suggesting that his argument was the conservative argument. Notice how he begins the speech by saying, I just want everybody to understand that I'm approaching this from a very national perspective. And anyone who suggests that I'm a sectional person is wrong. And by the way, I'm all about the Union, not any kind of a sectional approach. He even says later in the speech, look, if in order to save the Union, we have to allow slavery to expand, I'm for that. So he emphasizes throughout or makes the argument that he's the conservative and Douglas is the radical. Notice how he, one of his arguments is the founders, and Jason laid this out perfectly, the founders were constantly restricting the growth of slavery, whether it be the Northwest Ordinance and the Missouri restriction. I mean, go down the list, and he does a great job, as Jason pointed out, of going through that history. But to suggest that your approach to this is the founders' approach is inherently conservative. He also says that, or he approaches the issue of slavery by noting that the South, kind of having forgiving remarks about the South. The South is just as we would be if we had been a region that was populated with slaves. So he goes out of his way not to condemn the South, although he doesn't note that how the South acknowledges the humanity of slaves in countless ways. But again, in the sectionalism course, I often draw the parallel between Lincoln's approach to slavery's expansion and his approach to the problem of alcoholism in the temperance speech. Remember in the temperance speech, Lincoln famously says, well, look, if people are plagued with addiction, we shouldn't condemn them. We should approach their problem with love and forgiveness. and reach out to help them, not denounce them as, moral reprobates. Well, in the same fashion, here you have the problem of slavery's extension, which Lincoln clearly, bluntly says that slavery is morally wrong. But he also says to Southerners, well, look, you're not bad people. I'm paraphrasing now. You're not bad people. Well, you're doing just what we would do if we had been born with slaves. I'm always struck when I read this again this afternoon in preparation of this. I'm always struck about how Lincoln pitches this in such moderate tones and claims the conservative mantle. He's always at pains to differentiate himself from the abolitionist movement, which, of course, Garrison willingly embraced the radical, pose of burning the Constitution publicly and all that stuff. Lincoln recognizes that as a politician in a state like Illinois and writ large in the North, he has to appeal to kind of the sensible center. And so he does that right out of the can.
Let's talk a little before we get too much into the substance of the speech, and we already have a couple of questions I'm aware of, and we will get to as soon as possible. I want to talk a bit about the context for this. As Jason points out, 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act is signed. Lincoln is outraged. This is, as we've already established, someone who served one term in the House of Representatives. Who's coming to listen to him? I mean, how does this work out? What is he addressing a particular body? Has he been invited?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll jump in there. I mean, we could say more about why Lincoln hated this doctrine of popular sovereignty as spun by Douglas. Why that was so important to him in the rest of the webinar, I hope. But just as far as context goes, and Dan, jump in and correct me if I'm wrong about this or add what I'm missing, because yeah, John, that's a good question. My understanding is that, well, first of all, right, it's as you mentioned, 1854, October 16th. So just last Saturday was the anniversary of this speech, funny enough. So good timing. My understanding is that Lincoln and Douglas are both there. That Douglas had delivered a speech prior to Lincoln giving these remarks. That Douglas had spoken, and it got to be later in the evening around supper time. Lincoln goes on the stage and says, I'm going to respond to Douglas, and I've talked with him, and he's going to offer a rebuttal, a rejoinder at the end of my remarks. So Republicans, Democrats, stick around. Go and get your meal, go and get your supper, come back about 7 o'clock. I'm going to give a speech. And you Democrats, I know you'll leave if you don't think you'll hear from Douglas again. So I'm going to allow Douglas to respond to me. And I hope you'll stick around and watch him skin me. Right. He's speaking to the Democrats. Right. So I don't know how long the evening lasted. Right. If they reconvene back at 7 p.m. And Lincoln gives this speech, which is a monster in and of itself. And then Douglas replies. I mean, they must not have been done by midnight or so. It must have been a long night.
I'll just chime in too that Lincoln is running for state representative, but he didn't have really any great desire to be in the state legislature again. He'd done that before. He'd been there and done that in the 1830s. So he was, but it was just kind of his segue back into politics. And I think that he hoped, and of course, this is exactly what happens. He hoped that he could make a big enough splash that he would be considered as a candidate for the Senate, and the Illinois Senate race was, or the Senate seat was up for voting in the state legislature in the beginning of 1855. And of course, he ends up being a viable candidate for the Senate. But Jason set the stage perfectly there in Peoria. There's, in essence, although they're not having a kind of formal debate, they're basically debating. Every Republican candidate in Illinois was using Douglas as a foil because he was so unpopular because of his Kansas-Nebraska Act, which opened the big can of worms about slavery expansion again.
Okay, so just quick to this point of context, Timothy Phillips asks, do we have Douglas's rebuttal? I had been thinking about that myself.
I'm sure we probably do. I hate to admit it. I don't know if I've read his rebuttal to the Peoria address. Dan, do you know?
I'm sure it's out. It's
Mhm.
probably in one of the Democratic newspapers, but no, I don't. I'm not aware of it. I'm not looked at it. I mean, Douglas's argument, though, I mean, would be similar to his argument that he pitches to Lincoln in 1858. You know, it's all about popular sovereignty, the
Mhm.
sacred right of self-government. This is the true founder's policy, and Lincoln's the dangerous radical who's against, the kind of sober, steady course of a divided country fully enslaved that is Douglas's vision of the founders. And let me just say something else within this context question. And this goes to like Lincoln's moderation. You have to remember that Illinois is divided politically between a northern portion of the state that's predominantly anti-slavery and a southern portion of the state that's not necessarily pro-slavery, but is kind of anti-abolitionist. And then you have this band in the middle. It's called, it's been referred to as the Whig Belt by Gelzo and others. I actually wrote an article about this 20 years ago. Between Quincy and Danville, that's populated by Whigs, even though the Whig Party is pretty much fizzled out, and they're anti-slavery, but they're also anti-abolitionists. You know, they're the chin pullers. You know, I often describe them as they're the people sitting on the porch, you know, kind of rocking, going, "Well, I don't really like that Garrison guy. You know, he seems, you know, kind of radical and kind of an old man's voice." So this is why Lincoln is pitching his argument. You know, this is really kind of his intended audience. He wants to, you know, he feels slavery is morally wrong, but he doesn't want to attack it in the tones and in the vituperative and nasty way that Garrison does, because when he does that, all those old Whigs in Central Illinois will go, "Well, I don't like that." You know, I mean, they're offended by that rhetoric, and they said it divisive and productive of disunion. So Lincoln, you know, that's the other context of this. You know, Lincoln's outraged. You know, Jason did a great job setting this up. Lincoln's outraged about the abandonment of the Missouri restriction, the possible expansion of slavery. He sees that as a terrible mistake. It brings him back into politics, but his instinct is to pitch this in a moderate way. And also, it just has to be said, I don't want to suggest that Lincoln's doing this just as out of political calculus. I think that's the real Lincoln. You know, I think that's Lincoln. He's not William Lloyd Garrison. You know, his approach to this is a kind of sober Whig Constitution and law approach.
So let's get to some questions we have from those joining us. Please comment. Shaylin Nelson asks, please comment on the confusion Lincoln expresses on what to do about slavery. He refers to page 73. Unfortunately, I just have a printout from the website. I don't have the book in front of me, but if you do, you can go to page 73. This is the section that begins, "If all earthly power were given me, I should not know what to do, ... While attacking the institution head on, page 77, that no man is good enough to govern another man without that other's consent. Is there a tension between these statements?
Is there a tension between
what do I do? His uncertainty about what to do about slavery on the one hand, and the fact that he is clearly an opponent of slavery on the other.
Yeah, no, that is a good question. It's this part of the speech, right, where he says, "If all earthly power were given to me, I admit that I don't know how I would solve the situation." Right, as Dan mentioned earlier, right, that's another form, I think, of Lincoln, right, looking at the South and saying, if we were in their spot, we wouldn't know what to do with it either. We would probably, think the same thoughts that they think if we had grown up with it as they did. He goes on to say, right, if all earthly power was given to me, I wouldn't know what to do. My first inclination would be to free them all and send them to someplace, maybe Liberia. But then on second thought, right, I would have to consider, right, that's sort of right, if not impossible, at least exceedingly impractical. They probably, right, would not be able to last for very long in Liberia. Although Lincoln played with the idea of colonization, or at least considered it as a possibility up until as late as 1862, I think, right, as maybe one way, along with compensated emancipation, compensated emancipation or gradual emancipation with compensation to slave masters, and then freeing the slaves and sending them to Liberia. Of course, view of abolitionists like Frederick Douglass in regards to any proposal regarding colonization was, what are you talking about? We can't go back to Africa. We're not Africans anymore. We're Americans. This is our home. And so Lincoln admits here, I don't have a practical solution for resolving the slavery crisis, right? Just as Thomas Jefferson and other founders had said, if anybody has an idea, let's hear it. We're going to try to limit slavery to those places where it currently exists, prevent its extension, and as Lincoln says, put it into course of ultimate extinction, but nobody has a practical, immediate remedy at hand. For Lincoln, however, that was okay so long as the public mind continued to rest in the belief that slavery was wrong and in the course of ultimate extinction, because that conformed with, as Lincoln put it here, my ancient faith that all men are created equal. That sheet anchor of American republicanism, as he calls it, the passage from the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. The main reason Lincoln hates Kansas, Nebraska, and that's the word he uses. He uses the word hate. He hates Kansas, Nebraska, and Douglas's version of popular sovereignty, because, as Lincoln puts it in this speech, quoting his beau ideal of a statesman, Henry Clay, Judge Douglas was attempting to blow out the moral lights around us with popular sovereignty. He was attempting to go back to the era of the Revolution and muzzling the cannon that thunders its annual joyous return. Stephen Douglas was attempting to read out of the Declaration of Independence the equality of all the races and to turn it into a nation built on the principles of white supremacy. And one where, following that great principle, as he put it, of popular sovereignty, communities of men could decide to destroy the equality principle, to destroy our ancient faith by simply voting to have slavery, because that's what popular sovereignty was for Douglas. It was the freedom of the people to choose for themselves their own institutions. So in the territories, we repeal the Missouri Compromise, those portions north of the 3630 line, which previously under Missouri, those had to be free because they were north of the 3630 line. Kansas, Nebraska, in repealing that act says, no, those don't have to be free. We'll just let the people of those territories decide for themselves whether they want slavery or not. And if they decide to come into the Union with slavery, that's okay. If they decide to come in with the Free State Constitution, that's okay too, Douglas says. I don't care about slavery. I don't care whether slavery is voted up or down. I do care a great deal, Douglas would say, for that principle of popular sovereignty, for the people to choose for themselves whether or not they want slavery or not. But I'm indifferent to slavery. And that is what incensed Lincoln, that you could be indifferent to the principles of the Revolution, indifferent to the principle of equality that states that all men are created equal, which is what popular sovereignty was through voting, attempting to destroy.
All right, Dan.
Oh, that's very well said. I would just to continue Jason's point. I think one of the key aspects of Lincoln's argument is, and Jason just hit on this, so I'm just going to amplify it, is his defense of the Declaration. You know, Lincoln notes that a Democratic congressman named Pettit from Indiana had called the Declaration a self-evident lie, and Lincoln says, "Well, this is basically what where we're at in 1854. We've gone from the Declaration and its sacred second paragraph is the founding ideal of the country, all men are created equal, to it's a self-evident lie." And Lincoln says when Pettit said that in Congress, nobody said anything. You know, in other words, nobody got up and said, "What the hell? I mean, what are you talking about? So Lincoln's concern, and Jason put his finger right on this. Lincoln's concern is this is kind of a definitional or existential crisis for the United States. If you accept Douglas's care not doctrines, Lincoln describes it in the debates, it doesn't matter if slavery goes into Kansas and Nebraska any more than it matters that Maine has cranberry laws. If you accept that, if it doesn't matter to you, that slavery becomes the kind of sine qua non, or the whole purpose, the central institution of the country, well, that's very concerning. And so Lincoln's argument against Douglas more or less is constantly that he's changing the existential character of the United States. And he's doing this time and time again by attempting to pitch slavery back onto the people of the territories. Lincoln says, look, this is an issue that concerns all the people, not just, a handful, as he describes it, a handful in Kansas. And I think in many respects, Lincoln's very prophetic about this. I mean, I do think that the United States was at a kind of tipping point as far as the definitional character of the country. And Lincoln was right to kind of be the man waving his hands and going, now, wait a minute. Is this really what we want to do? Is this what we're really about? I don't think so. And again, I think he does this in a moderate tone. I think he's very careful to couch it in language that suggests that he's not a kind of, Garrisonian radical. But nevertheless, his approach to this is very strong. And I think he was right. I think he's absolutely right. I think if slavery had expanded and if the American people accepted Douglas's argument that they really didn't give a damn about where it was, and it was just kind of up to people in that region, I think you could, given the 3/5 rule, you could have ended up with a kind of slave majority in the Congress again, dictating policy.
It's very interesting to me that right out of the gate, Lincoln says this declared indifference. That is, here's Douglas throwing up his hands and saying, I'm indifferent to whether a state has slavery, is actually, quote, covert real zeal for the spread of slavery, unquote. That really seems to be fighting words there. He's not as indifferent as he thinks. What's his reason for thinking that Douglas is not as indifferent as he claims?
Yeah, that's a good point, John. I think it goes back to what Dan was just describing for us, what the possible future for the United States would look like if Lincoln was not there standing out saying, no, halt, stop. Because if Douglas gets his way, if the country is persuaded by popular sovereignty, right? So, for instance, at one point, many thought Douglas was about to become a Republican. I think Lincoln was afraid that maybe the Republican Party would embrace Douglas and his popular sovereignty as the way forward for the country, as the compromise that we've all been looking for. That Lincoln considered if Douglas's brand of popular sovereignty takes root, it's not to be declared indifference. It will actually result practically in the expansion of slavery, right? Covert real zeal for the spread of slavery, as he puts it, because Douglas also was the fierce manifest destiny man, right? Who believed that, the country is going to and must, in fact, expand, not just east and west, but north and south as well, right? Douglas, had visions of, incorporating Canada, Mexico, Latin America, and South America, right? One great American empire. And in Cuba and in Latin America and South America, following the principle of popular sovereignty, those are ripe slave fields for new slave states entered into the Union on the basis of popular sovereignty. Douglas's declared indifference would result in the expansion of slavery, and maybe even, as he'll put it elsewhere, in where slavery will become will cover the entire American continent. It will be alike lawful in all the states, old as well as new, north as well as south, to quote from the House Divided speech.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, what Lincoln has done here is unite in his argument against Douglas. he's united the concerns that people in the North had with the slave power, the idea that the tiny population of slave owners who had large slave workforces had a kind of disproportionate influence over the federal government, which had been a concern for many decades now. I mean, you could go back to 1819 or post-war of 1812, where, a lot of hand-wringing over that begins. But Lincoln's taken, so that's kind of an ongoing concern. I think it kind of peaks in the 1850s too, especially in the wake of Kansas, Nebraska. But he's linked that to a moral argument against slavery. When Lincoln says, look, what Douglas is essentially arguing is that I shouldn't object to slaves going to Kansas because slaves are no different than hogs. I mean, it's just somebody's property, and that would be true if slaves were the same as hogs, but they aren't, are they? They're men, they're people, and if that is so, well, then my ancient faith teaches me that all men are created equal. And he quotes the Declaration. It's really quite moving. I read it to students, I get all verklempt. I mean, it's just very moving. So he's approaching Douglas's argument by uniting the moral condemnation of slavery with this kind of political ongoing concern with the slave power, as when he addresses his concerns over the 3/5 rule. I mean, that's kind of ongoing. But I think that he's doing this by doing this. Mark Neely makes this point in one of his magnificent books. What Neely suggests is that what Lincoln has done is taken the moral argument that people like Garrison and Frederick Douglass were making from a kind of radical abolitionist perspective, which made it unacceptable to, those conservative chin-pulling Whigs sitting on a porch in, Quincy. He's made that, he's pitching it now in a kind of moderate way. In other words, he's taking that moral argument and cloaking it within that kind of Whiggish concern over constitution of the law and the law. So I think Neely's right. I think he's in other words, he's taking that radical abolition argument and making it palatable to a wider audience. And so he's, this is his approach to Douglas's argument that Jason laid out so expertly.
So this is so either Douglas is profoundly stupid as to not be able to see what the consequence of this will be, or he's not as indifferent to slavery as he's making things out to be.
Well, if Jason doesn't mind me leaping the queue here, I just want to say this about Douglas. I think that Douglas was, I don't know that Douglas was stupid, but I think that Douglas was animated by a desire to settle the country. Jason did this perfectly. He's an expansionist. He wants a territorial aggrandizement for the country, but he also wants to create a territorial government and a judicial system so people can actually go there. And so the railroad will be comfortable going there. The railroad was going to go anywhere unless they could get kind of a right of way and legal agreements that protected their track. And you couldn't have that unless you had a territorial government. So Douglas is animated by that, and it becomes, you have to remember, I think Douglas was much more of a legislator than an executive. He was very much a man of the House and then a man of the Senate. And his raison d'etre was to get things done. He was an action man. So I think that he's animated by a desire to organize these territories, to get it done. He's frustrated time and time again trying to organize Nebraska. And finally, he says, I think he just finally threw up his hands and said, well, what, it's kind of like the car salesman when you leave the lot a couple of times. What do I have to do to get you in this car? And you say, well, here's my price. Well, that's what happened with Kansas, Nebraska in January of 54. What do I have to do, David Atchison, you Southerners, to get you to agree to organize Kansas? And of course, their price was, well, you got to repeal the Missouri restriction. And Douglas said, okay. I think he says in his papers, well, I thought it was going to be a big storm, but I didn't realize that it would be a hurricane, So he acknowledges that, I kind of messed up on that. I didn't quite get it. It was going to be this big eruption. He thought it was going to cause problems and there would be some heartburning, to use the language of the period, but he didn't think it would be this colossal, where you had the, Democrats hiving off from the party and joining this anti-Nebraska coalition that becomes the Republican Party. I think that just blew his mind.
Yeah, actually, if I could just add to that a little bit, because I also don't think Douglas is stupid. I mean, at this time, he is the leading politician of his day, not just in Illinois, but arguably the entire country. Lincoln isn't in 1854. Nobody knows who Lincoln is outside of Illinois. Many even outside of Springfield don't know who Lincoln is. But everybody knows who Stephen Douglas is. Many think he's going to be the Democratic presidential nominee in 56. He's not. That goes to Buchanan. But even, during 1858 and the debates with Lincoln, I mean, everybody assumes that Douglas will be the Democratic nominee for president. And that very well may have happened with Douglas's doctrine of popular sovereignty. I think, right, two things happened that kept Douglas off that ticket. One was Dred Scott, and the other was Abraham Lincoln. We could talk more about that, how Douglas was never quite able to square that circle, that is, reconcile popular sovereignty with the outcome of the Dred Scott decision, and how that led to a breakup of the Democratic Party, a split in the Democratic Party that leads to a split in the Democratic ticket in the 1860 election, where Douglas represents, right, the Northern Democrats, but you've got another candidate for the South. And so Lincoln, the Republican, right, wins that election. Douglas was not dumb, but he was also something to keep in mind. Just in defense of Douglas, he was a strong Union guy. He really thought popular sovereignty could save the Union. And so when the South secedes, he doesn't go with the South. He stays loyal to the Union. In fact, there's this great story where Lincoln goes to deliver his first inaugural address on March 4th of 1861, right on the eve, the precipice of Civil War. And, he walks up to the lectern here. He's got his speech, the pages of his speech all together. And he puts the speech down on the lectern, and then he goes and takes off his famous, right, stovepipe hat and goes to look around for a place to set his hat down. And he can't find a place to put his hat down so he can give his speech. From behind him, from the crowd, emerges Stephen Douglas, who then comes forward, takes Lincoln's hat and holds it for him during the duration of Lincoln's inauguration.
It's a great story. Well, specifically on the topic of Douglas, Matt Kahnbaugh asks, do you believe that Lincoln reacts differently would he have reacted differently had the Kansas-Nebraska Act been authored by someone other than Stephen Douglas? In other words, do we see Lincoln's relationship with Douglas playing a role in his reaction?
I think that Lincoln would have opposed the repeal of the Missouri restriction, no matter who it came from. Now, having said that, Lincoln was, and Jason said this perfectly, Lincoln was and Douglas were rivals all their lives. And Lincoln and Douglas, I don't think, liked each other. I don't think there was any great affection between the two. Jason's noticed Douglas's noble gesture, holding Lincoln's hat. And it has to be said that, Douglas's decision to support the Union in April '61, and indeed to speak in favor of the Union in the waning weeks of the campaign in 1860, when it was clear he was already going to lose. Douglas actually goes south and gives speeches in favor of the Union in the fall of '60, which is really a noble gesture. But they were great. They were both very competitive. Again, Jason is absolutely right. Douglas was a kind of political celebrity, was kind of a rock star. And Lincoln was not, and Lincoln was a very ambitious man, and I think he resented that. And I also think that Lincoln thought that Douglas's policies were profoundly wrong. There's not a lot, when they debate in 1858, there's not a whole lot of warmth on those platforms. So by all accounts, it wasn't like they embraced and were jolly good, competitors. It was more of like, they really went after each other tooth and tongue. And even the tone of this Peoria speech, this is not the Lincoln of 1840s, where he, the famous skinning of Thomas, where Lincoln would savage a political opponent. He's much more mature, but even this speech is filled with kind of with sarcasm and little jibes at Douglas. So they were foes in every sense of the term.
I think just to add to that a little bit, I think Douglas early on underestimated Lincoln and came to really, especially in the 1850s, up through the debates, to respect Lincoln and his way with words. I think Douglas had underestimated him because, again, he was a political nobody. They knew each other. They went back, many, many years, but Douglas never saw him as a serious rival until much later, much too late for Douglas.
Yeah, it just has to be said, if you forgive me for jumping in one more time, it just has to be said that Lincoln was always the smartest guy in the room. He was very, very smart. I never got a sense of this until I was on the Lincoln Papers Project for a year early in my career, and I read some of Lincoln's legal briefs on law cases. I'd read the speeches and was very impressed too, but he was a very smart guy. I mean, David Davis famously said, other lawyers would see Lincoln's kind of unprepossessing appearance and kind of mistake him for this bumpkin and think, well, I'm going to kick this guy's fanny in court. I can't wait to get in there. And he said, without exception, those men found themselves on their backs in a ditch. In other words, Lincoln just cut him up. I mean, he was a very smart guy. He was, in this speech, as Jason said at the beginning, it's over 3 hours long, but it's just kind of a tour de force. All angles of the issue explained, and Douglas's popular sovereignty utterly demolished. Who else could do that? I mean, he was very gifted.
David Stahl asks, it is my understanding that Lincoln was not in favor of the Mexican War when he was in Congress, and that this stemmed from the expansion of slavery, or the prospect of the expansion of slavery into Texas. Do you think this played a big part in his anger about the Kansas-Nebraska Act, or was it more the repeal of the neighboring state of Missouri and what that could, or I think this means the possible extension of slavery into the neighboring state of Missouri, and what that could possibly mean for those across the river in Illinois?
Yeah, I'll jump in and just say, yeah, that's absolutely right. That Lincoln was against the Mexican-American War when he was in Congress. Right, he would give these speeches where he would. He got the reputation as Spotty Lincoln as a result, where he demanded to know the precise spot on which American blood had been spilled, because there was uncertainty between the United States and Mexico about the western boundary of Texas, whether or not it was at the Rio Grande or not. And the president, Polk, had sent a portion of the American army down there and had essentially provoked the Mexican army into attacking them. And Lincoln, it was a congressman at the time, he introduces his spot resolutions, demanding again to know, right, where did the attack take place? Where did American blood shed? Was it shed on American soil, or was it shed on Mexican soil? And he demanded an answer from Polk. His resolutions were never adopted. Nobody really took Lincoln's objections very seriously. It did get him the unpopular nickname Spotty Lincoln, as I mentioned. But Lincoln was always careful to point out, look, right, we Whigs in Congress, we may have objected to the war, but we were always in favor of providing supplies and money and munitions to the troops. Douglas later would accuse Lincoln of being unpatriotic for not supporting the Mexican-American War, and Lincoln would carefully correct him by saying, no, we objected in the way in which the war was initiated. But once initiated, we always voted to support the army. What that has to do with slavery, and then later the repeal of the Missouri Compromise, is that Lincoln was concerned about, well, exactly what ended up happening, right? As a result of the Mexican War, you get this vast new territory, including California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, portions of Colorado, I believe, as well. And it once again, just as in the past, it stirs up that slavery question again whenever the United States acquires new territory. Lincoln had actually objected to Texas coming into the Union as a slave state. And his concern was out west, what will happen to these areas in regards to the slavery question? You're going to get, in other words, more slave states as a result. And that will lead to, of course, the crisis of 1849, 1850, and the resulting compromise of 1850 to overcome that latest crisis that came out of the Mexican-American War, which is the last major historical event that Lincoln talks about in his short history at the beginning of this speech here at Peoria, before saying, and now the question is back to us again. Now here, just 4 years later, after the compromise of 1850, we thought we had settled it once and for all. And here it is, we're back again 4 short years later. And now we're talking about it again with the repeal of the Missouri Compromise and Douglas's Popsov doctrine in the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854.
Yeah, I think that's all right. I'll just throw in a couple of comments. I think that Lincoln regarded the Mexican War as inherently destabilizing. Polk when begins, I think he's concerned as the Whigs were not in favor of expansion. They regarded expansion as something that could cause all kinds of problems, and they were for well, let's just develop the existing national domain. We have enough. We don't need to maybe in time we'll absorb more, but right now we should just focus on this. So this isn't to suggest that I think Jason's absolutely right. It's the slavery issue is the great conundrum of that. But I think he sees the Mexican War as destabilizing and potentially causing lots of problems. In 1854, I think he's concerned, in the wake of statements like Pettit of Indiana makes, where he says the Declaration is a self-evident lie. And Douglas is saying, well, let's just allow the people of the territories to determine whether to have slavery or not. Slavery is going to be allowed to expand. Now he sees this as an existential crisis. Holy something, Batman. This is the country going away from principles and maybe becoming something else like a slaveocracy or something, or a slave republic, that oxymoron.
Yeah, destabilizing and possibly even unjust.
Absolutely.
As we're running out of time, I'd like to turn now to the fallout from this speech. A couple of people have asked about this. Adam Cooper asks, how did different cohorts of Americans respond to this speech? And then Adam Cooper and Dave Kress have both asked about its effects on party politics, specifically the continuing dissolution of the Whig Party and the development of the Republican Party. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I guess I'll start. Although maybe Dan can add more than I can, because I'm really not quite sure about being able to answer all of those questions about the aftermath of the speech. I will say that this was the first time that Lincoln had printed an anti-slavery speech. Right, that is a speech entirely focused on anti-slavery sentiments that had come out in other speeches as well. But this is the first time, and Lincoln worked hard on this speech. This, as you could tell, this is a long speech. This is not something he threw together at the last minute. This was him throwing his hat back into the political ring. This was, there was a good book that came out not too long ago, just a whole book on this speech. Lerman, is that right, Dan?
Yeah. Well, who does Lewis Lerman did
Lewis Lerman, yeah.
He did Cooper Union, I think. Somebody else did a book on the Peoria speech, but
I thought Lewis Lerman did Peoria and Harold Holzer did the Cooper
Union.
You're
right. No, you're right. I think you're right.
Yeah. The subtitle of that Peoria book was Turning Point, I think. This was the turning point. This was Lincoln coming back into political theater, coming back onto the political stage. And he never leaves it again. I just want to read one portion of this speech, which is always, I mean, as Dan pointed out, there are many, many virtues of this speech. You see Lincoln's great rhetoric, his oratory in this speech. His understanding of the founding and just the beauty of his words in expressing the spirit of 76, as he calls it, my ancient faith. I just want to read this one paragraph, because Lincoln is telling us all what's at stake, right? Because, Douglas, he says, well, I sort of expected a storm, but not a hurricane. Lincoln brought the hurricane, Lincoln brought the hurricane because for him, everything was at stake. What was at stake, what was the real issue here, was not just the future of the Union, right? But the principles of the Declaration of Independence, the principles of freedom, equality, equal liberty. That's what is at stake. This isn't typical party politics. This is something else altogether. This is the thing for which once united all Americans together as one people, as Thomas Jefferson put it in the Declaration of Independence, now we're starting to split apart over this issue of slavery and the principles of the Declaration. So I'll shut up and stop talking and let Lincoln do some talking for us here. This is towards the end of the speech. Just one of my favorite passages from the speech. He says this: "Our Republican robe is soiled and trailed in the dust. Let us repurify it. Let us turn and wash it white in the spirit, if not the blood of the Revolution. Let us turn slavery from its claims of moral right back upon its existing legal rights and its arguments of necessity. Let us return it to the position our fathers gave it, and there let it rest in peace. Let us readopt the Declaration of Independence, and with it the practices and policy which harmonize with it. Let North and South, let all Americans, let all lovers of liberty everywhere join in the great and good work. If we do this, we shall not only have saved the Union, but we shall have so saved it as to make and to keep it forever worthy of the saving. Worthy of the saving. We shall have so saved it that the succeeding millions of free, happy people the world over shall rise up and call us blessed to the latest generation."
That's great stuff. I think that's the true ending of the speech. You know, he goes on for a while longer after that, but that's the real ending. Mm-hmm. And notice the moderation in there, where Lincoln says we need to readopt the Declaration. We need to link or go back to the policy of the founders, which was restriction and dealing with it out of necessity. He's always stressing a kind of inherent conservatism. That's great. We're glad you read that. It's fabulous.
Any record of how this speech was received in the South?
I'm not sure if it was received at all. I don't know if anybody in the South even knew who Lincoln was at this point. By 1858, Lincoln will begin to get a reputation outside of Illinois. Lincoln will see to it that the debates with Douglas are published and sent out throughout the country and widely available. Lincoln will go on a series of speaking tours right through Ohio, elsewhere, New York, in Cooper Union, gathering a national reputation. But still, at this point, at 1854, I'm not sure how well known Lincoln, let alone this particular speech, is known in the South. Dan, do you have any idea? You probably know this better than I do.
I mean, he becomes a leading figure of the, remember in 1854, we're talking about an anti-Nebraska coalition that's made up of former Whigs, nativists, and Democrats. He becomes a leading figure of that coalition, I think it's fair to say, and a serious candidate for the Senate in Illinois in 1855. At the end, he loses and throws his supporters to Lyman Trumbull, who's a Democrat, an anti-Nebraska Democrat, to save the seat for the anti-Nebraska coalition, because some Democrats like John Palmer wouldn't support Lincoln. But as far as its reception in the South, I don't know that it made any great impact in the South, but Lincoln, other than to say this, Lincoln is regarded as one of the figures of the anti-Nebraska coalition, and therefore is not someone that the Southern political class would appreciate. In fact, would be inclined to, one of the great problems with the Southern perception of Lincoln was that they thought of him as a kind of Garrisonian, which he was not. I mean, their view of him was a total misconception, and that it kind of had tragic results in 1860.
So we're rapidly running out of time. I'm thinking that as a way of summing things up, you might make a pitch to the teachers assembled here. I assume that most who are listening are teachers. Why should they make room for this speech in their already crowded history curricula?
Yeah, so I guess I'll start and maybe just repeat the point I made at the top of the hour about the beginning of this speech, where Lincoln goes through that history, which really is, I think, about a third of the speech overall. That, and he's not even talking about popular sovereignty or my ancient faith or, sheet anchor of American republicanism. He's just giving you a history, right? I would encourage the teachers, right? If if you're using a textbook to get that history across, that's the history of the country in regards to slavery from 1776 up to 1854, essentially. I think we should, go with Lincoln here. This is better than any textbook I've ever seen on the matter. I mean, it's a great summary of and a condensed summary at that. I mean, as we may mention many times, the speech is very long, but Lincoln, I think, hits the high points and hits them in the right way. That right, it's clear and precise and concise. This history, I would maybe start with that. But even more important than that history is the way Lincoln talks about and defends the principles of the Union, the principles of the Declaration of Independence. That passage I read earlier about, right, we're not interested in trying to save the Union. We're trying to save a Union that's worthy of it, a Union worthy of the saving. In many ways, right, we're told by the textbooks that Lincoln during the Civil War was trying to save the Union. Well, that's not necessarily wrong, of course, but it's somewhat incomplete without these very moving passages for what the Union is, what it represents, why it's worth saving. And that is something I think that is often missed in our textbooks today, and something that Lincoln was the greatest teacher on. Lincoln was the greatest student of Thomas Jefferson, and Lincoln was the greatest teacher of the American founding since the founding generation itself. As Dan said, right, Lincoln is always the smartest person in the room. When you have the Peoria speech or any other Lincoln speech before you, Lincoln is in the room with you. You've got a piece of him there with you, a piece of his mind, a piece of his soul there, and you can ask him questions and really have a conversation with him. I would just encourage all the teachers out there to take advantage of that. Invite Lincoln into the room, let him teach you something. He always teaches me something. And I always know that he's always a much better teacher than I am. So it's good to let him, do most of the talking.
Dan, final thoughts.
I would just add to that by saying, if I were a teacher, I would use Lincoln's moral argument against slavery. Lincoln saying that, our government is founded on the consent of the governed, and including Black Americans in the Declaration. It's very inspiring. Lincoln was at pains to differentiate himself, and I think the country, from those who were dismissive, like Pettit of Indiana, who said the Declaration is a self-evident lie. By contrast, Lincoln says, when the white man governs himself, that's self-government. When he governs himself and also governs another man, that is more than self-government, that is despotism. It's great stuff. And I think sharing those words with students will help them recognize how unique and noble the Declaration is and American first principles are. And this is also why Lincoln should be revered. You hear talk about people pulling down Lincoln statues. I can't think of anything more abhorrent, because Lincoln really did re-envision and re-embrace the Declaration of Independence, and I think he should be celebrated for that.
Terrific. Well, thanks to both of our panelists, Jason and Dan, as well as to our participants for your thoughtful questions. As a reminder, you will be receiving an email within the next week. That email will include a link for a certificate of participation if you would like one. It will also contain the link to the archived webinar. We hope, please share this with your colleagues and share it on social media. Help us get the word out about these programs that we're putting on. If you've enjoyed today's webinar, please consider taking an online graduate course in our Master of Arts in American History and Government program. As I said at the outset, both of these scholars teach in that program. You can find more information about online course offerings, as well as many other resources for teachers at teachingamericanhistory.org. Our next episode of Documents in Detail will take place on the evening of Wednesday, November 17th, when our topic will be Judith Sargent Murray's On the Equality of the Sexes. That comes from our core document volume on gender equality. And joining me to talk about it on that occasion will be Dr. Sarah Morgan Smith, former director of faculty at the Ashbrook Center, and Dr. Cara Rogers of Ashland University. Thank you all for being with us tonight. We look forward to seeing you again on November 17th.
Thanks again for listening. You can learn more about our free resources and documents, collections, and programs for teachers of American history, government, and civics at teachingamericanhistory.org or TAH.org. And if you go to our bookstore, which is linked at the top of that site, and there you can find all of our core documents collections for purchase in paperback copy, but the PDF versions are free to download, distribute to your students, and use as you see fit. So go there and check that out, and thanks again for listening.